In the years before Abraham Lincoln entered the White House, the United States was already a nation teetering on the edge of crisis. Though bound together by the words of the Constitution, Americans in the North and South lived in worlds that were steadily drifting apart, pulled by forces both old and newly awakened. The very concept of liberty, so fiercely cherished at the nation's founding, had become a bitter paradox. While the North moved toward a society built on free labor and growing industry, the South clung ever more tightly to a system in which millions remained enslaved. Slavery, the central issue of the era, had shaped the nation's economic and political life since its earliest years. By the mid-19th century, the institution was deeply entrenched in the South, where enslaved people made up significant portions of the population and the wealth of entire states depended on their labor. Cotton, often called king cotton, dominated the Southern economy, and the plantations that produced it relied on the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. In contrast, the North had largely turned away from slavery, embracing free labor and the opportunities of industrial growth. Factories, railways, and an influx of immigrants created a dynamic society that looked very different from the plantation world below the Mason-Dixon line. This economic divergence widened the social and political divisions between the regions. The North attracted waves of immigrants who formed vibrant ethnic communities and supplied labor for new industries, though nativist sentiment sometimes ran high, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already fractured society. Meanwhile, the South grew increasingly insular, wary of outside influence and steadfast in its defense of slavery as both an economic necessity and a social good. These regional differences shaped not only how people lived and worked, but also how they saw themselves and their place within the American experiment. Sectionalism, a term describing fierce loyalty to one's own region over the nation as a whole, came to dominate the political conversation. Disagreements over the expansion of slavery into new Western territories produced some of the most bitter debates in Congress and beyond. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act are just a few examples of legislative efforts designed to contain the growing sectional crisis. Each of these measures was, in its own way, an attempt to balance the interests of North and South, free states and slave states. Yet each also revealed the limits of compromise, and time after time, the underlying conflict only deepened. While political leaders argued in the halls of government, ordinary Americans were also drawn into the conflict. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of routes and safe houses, enabled thousands of enslaved people to escape to the North and to freedom. These acts of resistance were met with fierce opposition from slaveholders and their allies, who viewed abolitionist activity as a direct assault on their way of life. The rise of the abolitionist movement further inflamed tensions, as activists from diverse backgrounds demanded the immediate end of slavery. Black abolitionists, many of whom had experienced slavery firsthand, provided powerful testimony to the brutality of the system. Their voices, alongside white allies like William Lloyd Garrison and the Weston sisters, reached a wider audience through speeches, pamphlets, and the coordinated efforts of anti-slavery societies. Abolitionism was not a monolith. It drew upon a variety of traditions, including the religious convictions of Quakers and the moral fervor of radical activists like John Brown. Some advocated for gradual emancipation, while others insisted that action must be immediate. The movement's biracial character was especially significant. Black and white abolitionists worked together, often at great personal risk, to challenge both the legality and morality of slavery. Their arguments found support not only in the pulpits and meeting halls of the North, but also in the powerful personal narratives of those who had escaped bondage. These lived experiences, preserved in speeches and slave narratives, made the realities of slavery impossible for many Americans to ignore. Meanwhile, the political world was undergoing its own upheaval. The question of whether new states and territories should permit slavery became the central issue dividing the nation's major parties. The Whig Party collapsed under the strain, and in its place, the Republican Party emerged as a new force, uniting those who opposed the spread of slavery into the West. Abraham Lincoln, a relatively little-known lawyer and former congressman from Illinois, rose within this new party as a moderate critic of slavery's expansion, someone who, as evidence suggests, could appeal to both conservative and more radical elements within the anti-slavery coalition. The election of 1860 unfolded against this backdrop of deepening crisis. The political landscape was so fractured that the Democratic Party split into northern and southern wings, each nominating its own candidate. In all, 4 major candidates vied for the presidency, each representing different visions for the nation's future. Lincoln, representing the Republican Party, carried the North and parts of the West with a platform that opposed the expansion of slavery but did not call for its immediate abolition where it already existed. The Democratic candidates, divided over the issue of slavery, could not unite behind a single message. Southern voters, feeling increasingly alienated from the nation's political process, turned to John C. Breckinridge, whose support for the protection of slavery in the territories was unequivocal. The Constitutional Union Party, seeking to hold the nation together by avoiding the slavery question altogether, nominated John Bell. Slavery and sectionalism dominated the campaign, even though, by the standards of later elections, there was very little direct campaigning. The nation's newspapers and pamphleteers filled the void, debating the merits and dangers of each candidate and amplifying the fears of their respective audiences. Lincoln's election in November 1860 was decisive in the North, but he failed to win a single electoral vote in most of the South. For many white Southerners, this outcome was nothing short of a catastrophe, confirming their belief that their way of life was under existential threat. Almost immediately, the crisis reached a breaking point. In the months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, 7 Southern states announced their secession from the Union. Their declarations, grounded in the language of states' rights, made clear that the preservation of slavery was the central grievance. These documents cited the rise of the Republican Party and Northern hostility to slavery as intolerable intrusions on their sovereignty and economic interests. The secession crisis unfolded rapidly. From December 1860 through June 1861, state after state left the Union, each citing what they viewed as irreconcilable differences with the North. This was not simply a political maneuver. It was, as many contemporary observers recognized, a profound breakdown of the democratic process. Americans found themselves confronting the possibility that the nation forged in revolution might now dissolve in civil war. On the eve of the conflict, 2 American societies faced each other across a widening chasm. In the North, industrialization, immigration, and reform had created a society oriented toward the future. In the South, the defense of slavery became intertwined with regional identity and notions of honor and autonomy. The debate over slavery, once thought containable through compromise and legislation, had become a battle over the very soul of the nation. By the time Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office, the United States was no longer simply divided, it was broken. The events of the preceding decades had transformed political disagreement into existential crisis, and the election of a president who opposed the spread of slavery was the spark that set the nation on the path to war. The stage was set and America stood on the brink. The morning Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office, the air in Washington, District of Columbia, was thick with uncertainty. He arrived in the capital under heavy guard, the threat of violence ever present, and the country he had sworn to lead was already coming apart at the seams. In the White House, Lincoln faced a task no president before him had ever confronted, the very real possibility that the United States might dissolve under his watch. The immediate aftermath of his election sent shockwaves through the South. As new Confederate leaders gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, and declared themselves a separate nation, Lincoln found himself caught in a philosophical and constitutional crisis that would test every fiber of his resolve. From the first moments of his presidency, Lincoln insisted that the Union was perpetual and indissoluble. He argued that no state had the right to break away on its own authority. To Lincoln, the United States was not a voluntary association that states could leave at will, but a binding legal compact. He laid out this position in his inaugural address and returned to it repeatedly in his official communications. The idea of secession, he maintained, was both unlawful and a direct threat to democracy itself. This conviction would shape every decision he made during those early, fraught months. Yet Lincoln's legal arguments did little to calm the waters. In the South, leaders believed they were fighting for their way of life and their rights under the Constitution. The Confederacy claimed legitimacy, asserting that the federal government had overstepped its bounds. Lincoln, in their eyes, was a tyrant intent on forcing unwanted change upon them. Debates over the legality and morality of secession raged in Congress, in state houses, and in the press. Some in the North called for compromise, others for a hard line, while border states watched warily, uncertain which way to turn. As president, Lincoln's most urgent challenge was to preserve the Union without provoking further conflict. He knew the fate of the nation hung on a knife's edge. Every decision was shadowed by the fear that additional states would join the Confederacy if he moved too forcefully, yet inaction risked making secession an accomplished fact. When he assumed office, Lincoln inherited a government already fractured, its departments riddled with Southern sympathizers, its military scattered and unprepared for war. He worked tirelessly to keep the border states, places like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, within the Union, knowing that their defection would be a mortal blow. Events soon forced Lincoln's hand. The most immediate crisis centered on a small federal outpost in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. The fort, still held by Union troops, stood as a symbol of federal authority deep within Confederate territory. Lincoln faced a fateful choice: abandon the fort in signal weakness, or attempt to resupply it and risk open conflict. After careful deliberation, Lincoln opted to send a relief expedition, informing South Carolina's governor that provisions, food, not arms, were on the way. He hoped this would avoid bloodshed while upholding the government's authority. The Confederates, however, saw things differently. To them, any attempt to reinforce Fort Sumter was an act of aggression. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire, bombarding the fort until its garrison surrendered. The news flashed across the country, electrifying both North and South. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter produced a wave of patriotic fervor. Lincoln moved swiftly. On April 15, he issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 militia to put down the rebellion. He summoned Congress to meet in special session, seeking the resources to wage what would become the nation's most devastating conflict. Lincoln's decisive response at Fort Sumter changed everything. In the North, it rallied public support behind the Union cause. Crowds flocked to recruiting stations, and the sense of crisis gave way to a grim determination. Yet Lincoln's call to arms also had unintended consequences. In the Upper South, where loyalties were divided, the prospect of federal troops marching through their states tipped the balance. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas soon seceded, swelling the ranks of the Confederacy and bringing the war to the nation's doorstep. From the Confederate perspective, Lincoln's actions at Fort Sumter were seen as a deliberate provocation. Southern leaders argued that he had forced their hand, making war inevitable. This debate over who truly started the war would echo long after the guns fell silent. But for Lincoln, the priority was clear: the Union must be preserved at all costs. Taking on the mantle of commander-in-chief, Lincoln found himself in uncharted territory. He had no military background and little experience with the machinery of war, yet he threw himself into the task, learning strategy, studying maps, and conferring with generals. In the beginning, he relied heavily on his advisors and military leaders, sometimes clashing with them as he tried to shape a coherent strategy. Lincoln's early relationship with his generals was often fraught. He struggled to find commanders with both the skill and the will to take the fight to the Confederacy. Over time, he grew more confident, asserting greater control over military affairs and refining his approach as the war evolved. Lincoln's leadership extended beyond the battlefield. He recognized that the war would require more than just armies. It demanded a mobilized nation. He worked with Congress to pass measures that would strengthen the Union cause, including economic incentives and the Land-Grant College Act, which laid the foundation for a new era of education and development. Lincoln's ability to balance the immediate demands of war with the long-term needs of the country became one of his defining qualities. Throughout these early months, the question of slavery loomed over every decision. While Lincoln had long opposed the expansion of slavery, he made it clear that his paramount goal was to save the Union. In a famous letter to journalist Horace Greeley, Lincoln explained that if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would do so. If he could save it by freeing all the slaves, he would do that. And if he could save it by freeing some and leaving others, he would do that too. His own words reflected the political pressures he faced from abolitionists, from the border states, and from within his own party. Abolitionists demanded immediate emancipation, while border states threatened to bolt if he moved too quickly. Lincoln walked a careful line, refusing to let the issue of slavery, at least in the early stages, overwhelm the fight to preserve the Union. As the war continued, Lincoln's views on slavery began to evolve. The pressures of conflict, the demands of military necessity, and the moral force of emancipation gradually pushed him toward a new understanding. But in those first turbulent months, the fate of the nation was still far from certain. Lincoln's early presidency was marked by uncertainty, improvisation, and a fierce determination to hold the country together. He entered office facing unprecedented challenges, and though he could not know what the future held, he resolved that the United States would endure, whatever the cost. The opening shots at Fort Sumter had transformed a political crisis into a war that would decide the fate of the nation, and Abraham Lincoln, thrust into the crucible of history, rose to meet the moment. Abraham Lincoln's presidency grew heavier with each passing month of war. As cannons thundered and casualty lists lengthened, Lincoln's thoughts on the nation's crisis deepened and shifted. He began his journey as a politician who opposed the spread of slavery, but not yet as an abolitionist. The reality of a war threatening the very existence of the United States forced him to reconsider not only his strategy, but also the moral purpose of the conflict itself. He was not alone in this transformation. Black abolitionists, radical Republicans, and countless enslaved people risking their lives for freedom all pressed the president and the Union toward a reckoning with slavery. Lincoln's earliest efforts to address slavery were cautious and incremental. He understood the deep divisions within the Union, especially in the border states, where loyalty to the United States was fragile and any move against slavery risked driving those states into the Confederacy. Meanwhile, abolitionists, both black and white, continued to speak out forcefully, arguing that the war would be meaningless if it left slavery intact. Black abolitionists in particular urged Lincoln to see emancipation not just as a political expedient, but as a matter of justice and humanity. Their activism, along with pressure from radical Republicans in Congress, shaped the debate in Washington and beyond. As the war dragged on, Lincoln came to see that emancipation might serve as a powerful weapon in the Union's arsenal. Not only would it strike at the economic heart of the Confederacy, which depended on enslaved labor, but it could also sap Southern morale and encourage enslaved people to seek freedom behind Union lines. The president's evolving views were not the result of a single revelation, but of an arduous journey shaped by the stubborn facts of war, the courage of those who fled slavery, and the persistent advocacy of those demanding freedom. The road to the Emancipation Proclamation was neither straight nor smooth. Lincoln first explored voluntary compensated emancipation in the border states, hoping to persuade slaveholders to free their enslaved people in exchange for payment. These efforts met with little success. Meanwhile, the war itself was changing. Enslaved people began to escape to Union lines, seeking safety and offering their labor to the Union cause. Union generals, unsure how to proceed, sometimes returned them to their enslavers, while others declared them contraband of war and refused to send them back. These acts of self-emancipation by the enslaved forced the government's hand, making it clear that the old order could not survive the conflict. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln concluded that a bold step was needed. The war was not going well for the Union, and public support was faltering. Lincoln feared that unless he took decisive action, the cause itself might be lost. He drafted a proclamation freeing enslaved people in those states still in rebellion, arguing that he was acting under his authority as commander-in-chief, using his war powers to weaken the enemy. Yet even as he prepared to issue the order, Lincoln waited for a Union victory, believing that such a dramatic move required the backing of military success. In September 1862, after the bloody but inconclusive Battle of Antietam, Lincoln seized the moment. He issued a preliminary proclamation, warning that unless the rebelling states returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, he would declare their enslaved people forever free. The Confederacy ignored the ultimatum. On New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, an act that would forever change the character of the war and the nation. The proclamation itself was a legal and military document, not a sweeping declaration of freedom for all. It applied only to areas in active rebellion, leaving slavery untouched in the border states and in regions of the South already under Union control. Critics noted these limitations, and even supporters understood that the proclamation's power depended on Union victory. Still, the significance of the moment was unmistakable. Enslaved people in Confederate territory, upon hearing of the proclamation, saw it as a promise of liberation and an invitation to seize their own freedom wherever possible. The act transformed the conflict from a war to save the Union into a war to end slavery, a change that Lincoln himself would later embrace in his rhetoric and policy. The effects of the Emancipation Proclamation rippled far beyond the letter of the law. It encouraged thousands of black men to enlist in the Union Army, transforming the struggle into a fight for their own liberation. Their courage and sacrifice on the battlefield gave new legitimacy to the cause of freedom and shifted public perception in the North. By redefining the stakes of the war, the proclamation made it difficult for European powers to support the Confederacy openly, as few nations would risk aligning themselves with a slaveholding rebellion now so plainly opposed by the Union. Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation was both a moral and a strategic act. He faced fierce criticism from all sides. Some in the North feared that emancipation would prolong the war or lead to racial strife, while others argued that it did not go far enough. In the South, Confederate leaders denounced the proclamation as an incitement to insurrection. Yet Lincoln stood firm, convinced that the Union could not be preserved without breaking the chains of slavery. The years 1863 and 1864 marked profound turning points, not only in Lincoln's presidency, but in the war itself. The twin Union victories at Gettysburg in the East and Vicksburg in the West shattered Confederate hopes for foreign intervention and split the South along the Mississippi River. These triumphs, achieved at staggering cost, gave Lincoln the political capital to push forward with emancipation and to reinforce the Union's moral claim. The battles of 1863 shifted the momentum decisively toward the North, making eventual victory possible. As the war entered its final phase, Lincoln's vision for the country expanded. He began to articulate a broader purpose for the conflict, one that looked beyond the battlefield to the nation's future. In his brief but powerful Gettysburg Address, delivered on a November afternoon in 1863, Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom, linking the Union's cause to the fundamental principles of liberty and equality. This speech did not lay out a detailed plan for the future, but it offered a glimpse of a more perfect Union, one cleansed by the sacrifices of war and rededicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's leadership during this period was marked by determination, flexibility, and a willingness to learn from experience. He took a direct role in shaping military strategy, replacing generals who failed to deliver results and supporting those who could match his resolve. He insisted on unrelenting pressure against Confederate forces, embracing what historians call hard war tactics that targeted not only enemy armies but also the economic foundations of the Confederacy. The president's ability to adapt, to listen to advisors, and to make difficult choices was crucial in turning the tide of war. As Union armies advanced, Lincoln also began to consider how the nation would reunite after the guns fell silent. His plan for Reconstruction, announced in 1863, offered amnesty to most former Confederates willing to swear loyalty to the Union and accept emancipation. This approach, though never fully realized in his lifetime, reflected Lincoln's hope for reconciliation and for the integration of free people into American society. He understood that the destruction of slavery would require not just legal decrees, but a transformation of Southern society and politics. The war's end was not yet in sight, and Lincoln continued to face enormous challenges, including political opposition and uncertainty about his own re-election. But by 1864, the Union's prospects had brightened. The Emancipation Proclamation, the hard-won victories on the battlefield, and the enlistment of black soldiers all combined to drive the Confederacy toward collapse. The nation that would emerge from this crucible would be profoundly different from the one that entered it. The Civil War, with Lincoln at its center, had become a struggle not just to preserve the Union, but to remake it, dedicated to freedom and, for the first time, committed to ending the blight of slavery. In the final reckoning, Lincoln's decisions during the Civil War, above all, his embrace of emancipation, transformed the conflict and the country itself. The war destroyed the slave society of the South, set in motion new social and political realities, and forced Americans to confront the unfinished promises of their founding ideals. Lincoln did not live to see the full results of his vision, but the road to Union victory and emancipation was, in large measure, his own. Out of war, a new nation was indeed born, marked by both the cost of freedom and the hope of a more just future. As the final months of the Civil War unfolded, Abraham Lincoln stood at the helm of a battered nation, his leadership marked by extraordinary resilience and a vision that extended beyond the smoke of battlefields. The war's outcome, once so uncertain, now tilted decisively toward the Union, and Lincoln's re-election in 1864 reflected a renewed faith in his guidance. The American public, weary from years of conflict and loss, narrowly returned him to office, signaling not only confidence in his leadership, but also a mandate for reunification and healing. Yet for Lincoln, victory on the battlefield was only part of the struggle. He understood that the peace to come would need to rest on foundations stronger than those that had crumbled in secession and war. In these closing days, Lincoln's thoughts remained fixed on the daunting challenges ahead. The devastation across the South was profound. Cities and farmlands lay scarred, and millions of newly freed people faced an uncertain future. Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction, outlined in his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, revealed a leader striving for both pragmatism and principle. He offered a path for Southern states to rejoin the Union, requiring that 10% of their voters swear loyalty to the United States and accept the end of slavery. A significant concession designed to make reconciliation possible without bitterness or vengeance. The full text of his proclamation, preserved in his own hand, stands as a testament to his clear intent to restore civil government and rights to those willing to return, while drawing a firm line against the perpetuation of slavery. This was not merely a policy paper, but a blueprint for rebuilding a fractured nation. Even as he laid out terms for amnesty, Lincoln knew that integrating free people into American life would not be achieved by proclamations alone. His vision for Reconstruction, as historians have noted, was never fully realized. The amendments that followed, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, would abolish slavery, establish birthright citizenship, and guarantee voting rights, but the struggle to secure these rights for freed people became the central drama of the post-war years. Lincoln's own plans stopped short of full equality, but he set in motion a process that would redefine the meaning of freedom and citizenship in the United States. At the heart of Lincoln's leadership in these final days was a remarkable blend of toughness and compassion. The war had demanded a steely will, but Lincoln's public addresses, especially his second inaugural, revealed the depth of his humanity. With the war nearly at its end and the nation's wounds still raw, he stood before his fellow citizens and called for malice toward none, charity for all. These words, spoken in the shadow of immense suffering, captured his hope for national renewal. He did not seek to punish the South, nor did he indulge in triumphalism. Instead, he urged Americans to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for those who had borne the battle, and to strive for a just and lasting peace. The realities of Reconstruction, however, would prove far more tangled than Lincoln might have hoped. The political contest over how to reunite the nation and secure the rights of freed people quickly became a struggle of competing visions. The amendments to the Constitution, the 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th establishing equal protection, and the 15th securing the vote, were landmarks, but their meaning and enforcement would become the battleground of the post-war era. The unfinished work of freedom and equality, which Lincoln himself had called the great task remaining before us at Gettysburg, would outlive him. The new birth of freedom he envisioned was not guaranteed. It would require the courage and vigilance of generations to come. As Union armies closed in on the remnants of Confederate resistance, the war's end came into sight. The surrender at Appomattox in April 1865 marked a formal collapse of the Confederacy, but even this moment of triumph was fraught with uncertainty. Lincoln remained focused on the future, wary of the dangers of retribution and the temptations of easy answers. He understood, perhaps better than most, that peace was fragile and that the wounds of civil war would heal slowly, if at all. His leadership in these days, marked by perseverance, moral clarity, and a willingness to shoulder the burdens of command, set a standard that has shaped the nation's memory ever since. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued 2 years earlier, had begun the work of freedom, but Lincoln knew the true test would come after the guns fell silent. The legacy of emancipation would be felt for generations, both in law and in the lived experience of millions. The proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it redefined the Union's cause and laid the moral foundation for the 13th Amendment. Its long-term significance, as historians have noted, lies in its transformation of the Civil War from a battle to preserve the Union into a crusade for human liberty. That transformation, though incomplete, marked a turning point in American history. The war's end brought not only relief, but also tragedy. On the night of April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer enraged by Lincoln's abolition legacy. Booth's motives were rooted in the same passions that had torn the nation apart: anger at emancipation, hatred of Lincoln's policies, and a desperate hope to revive the Confederate cause. The assassination stunned the country. News spread quickly, and an outpouring of public mourning swept across North and South alike. For many, the loss was not just personal, but national, a sense that the country had been robbed of its guide at the very moment of deliverance. The immediate aftermath of Lincoln's death was marked by shock and grief, but also by deep uncertainty about the future. The transition to new leadership under Andrew Johnson brought its own challenges and controversies, and historians generally agree that Lincoln's absence altered the course of Reconstruction. His assassination closed the door on what might have been a more measured and conciliatory approach to reunification, opening the way to harsher policies and deeper political divisions. The nation mourned, but it also struggled to regain its footing in the face of unfinished business. In the years that followed, Lincoln's reputation grew beyond the man himself. He became, in the words of many observers, a mythic figure, a martyr to liberty, a symbol of unity, and a touchstone for American ideals. His image, shaped by memorials, biographies, and public memory, has come to embody both the nation's highest aspirations and its greatest struggles. Yet his legacy is not static. Over time, scholars and citizens alike have debated the meaning of his leadership, the limits of his vision, and the challenges that remain. The enduring influence of Lincoln lies not in perfection, but in perseverance, his willingness to face adversity, to learn and adapt, and to strive always for a more just and unified nation. For future generations, the lessons of Lincoln's leadership remain relevant. His constitutional vision, shaped by crisis, reminded Americans that the work of freedom and equality is never finished. He recognized that the nation he sought to save would have to be remade, not just preserved. The Civil War was a contest over the meaning of liberty and the promise of prosperity, and Lincoln's role in shaping the post-war nation cannot be overstated. His courage in the face of adversity, his commitment to the Union, and his evolving embrace of justice set a standard for all who would lead in troubled times. As the echoes of war faded and the country began its long journey of healing, the legacy of Abraham Lincoln endured. His leadership in the crucible of civil war helped define the future of the United States, not as a collection of divided states, but as a nation renewed by sacrifice and guided by the promise of liberty for all. The unfinished work of freedom, which he so often invoked, remains both an invitation and a challenge, a legacy that belongs not only to his time, but to every generation that follows.